Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 board game mechanics. Now I'm using the word mechanics or mechanisms as an umbrella term because strictly speaking, not all of these 10 entries can be defined as mechanics or mechanisms. A better term to encompass all of these entries would be categories. These are different styles of games, different ways of distinguishing these types of games from one another, board game genres, if you will. But again, for search engine optimization, I'll be using the word mechanics. So without any further explanation and any further ado, let's get straight to the list with my number 10 board game mechanic, which I'm referring to as Yahtzee style dice rolling. So this is games where the heart of the game is rolling dice, usually 5 or 6 of them. And in particular, you have 2 additional re-rolls at your disposal to try to roll the particular combinations that you want to do. And that's basically the essence of these style of games. Games in this category include King of Tokyo, very popular monster-themed game by Richard Garfield. We also have Run, Fight, or Die, which is a zombie survival-style game by Richard Lanius. And Roll Through the Ages, which is a civilization game in dice rolling form by designer Matt Leacock of Pandemic fame. So yeah, I really enjoy the re-rolling and the making the decisions with each subsequent reroll of whether or not we want to pick up some of the dice that we've already set apart and maybe recast them as well, hoping for a more optimal combination. Now, obviously, these games, for them to be meaty enough, will require some peripheral and additional mechanisms to be combined with the dice rolling. But at the heart of it, that's exactly what the game is. It's just a bunch of dice rolling, Yahtzee style, and re-rolling to your heart's content. Really enjoy these type of games. My number 10, Yahtzee style dice rolling. Now we move on to my number 9 board game mechanic, and that would be pick and pass card drafting, where players start the game or a round with a hand of cards. They're going to pick one, in some cases maybe multiple of these cards, set them aside in their player area, and then pass the rest of their hand to the player to their left or to the player to their right, depending. And basically they're going to keep on repeating this process until every player has their complete hand of cards for that round or for that game. I really enjoy that mechanism, the idea of having all these cards. You kind of want to keep them all, but you can only pick a few, and you're hoping that as the cards go around, that some of those are still waiting for you when they return, but quite often they are not. They're waiting for you. Really cool. Some of the games in this category include games like Sushi Go, very popular entry-level gateway-style game with a Japanese cuisine theme. Notre Dame, designed by Stefan Feld, a game that came out many years ago, and I think it was one of the first games to have that mechanism incorporated. Treasure Hunter by Richard Garfield, fantasy-themed card drafting game. That's the essence of the game. Blood Rage, although this game does not have the card drafting as the only thing going on, but it is something that goes on at the beginning of each round. Bunny Kingdom, another Richard Garfield design. That's an area majority game where the board is a grid consisting of lots of different spaces that players are trying to control. This is an area control game in essence, but you're trying to have lots of valuable territories based on the combination of their resources and their size. But in the beginning of each round, you're partaking in a card draft that will determine which cards you'll be able to play and which actions you'll be able to take in the following round. And then finally, the most popular game perhaps in this genre, and that is Seven Wonders, the civilization themed game. This game plays really quick, and that's basically what's happening. You're doing pick and pass card drafting and building your civilization as you go. I just really am thoroughly satisfied when games incorporate pick and pass card drafting in their design. My number 9 board game mechanic, pick and pass card drafting. Now we move on to my number 8 board game mechanic. And again, this one is more of a category than it is a mechanism, and that would be dungeon crawlers or dungeon crawls. I really like these games where players are usually partaking in a fantasy theme, and they are taking on the role of heroes, a band of heroes. Sometimes these games can be cooperative, sometimes they are competitive, and players are basically traversing the dark corridors of a labyrinth or a dungeon, and they're encountering different challenges and traps and different monsters and enemies that they have to compete and combat for. Usually there's direction and there's objectives. These games are usually scenario based and have a clear direction as to where they're going. And lots of these games include opportunities for character customization. As your character grows, the character will level up. They will improve in different stats and different categories. They'll acquire different items that, again, will enhance their abilities going forward. I really, really like everything, conceptually speaking, about a dungeon crawl style game. Now, some of the games that I play from this style of game that I really enjoy are, of course, Descent, the flagship game for many years, Hero Quest, the pioneer from decades ago, Arcadia Quest, fun little simple more modern dungeon crawl, Gloomhaven, very popular, #1 game on Board Game Geek, more of a Euro-style game, but incorporates lots of the things that I enjoy from dungeon crawlers, which is the exploration, which is the leveling up of characters. Massive Darkness, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Shadows of the Past, Sword and Sorcery, which is a little bit more of a heavier, a little bit more of a fiddlier dungeon crawl, but very fun and very immersive from a storyline perspective. And Tiny Epic Dungeons from Gamelin Games, a very recent release that I'm enjoying for a smaller, more compact version of a dungeon crawl. So that's my number 8 board game mechanic, dungeon crawlers. Now, my number 7 board game mechanic or category, very similar to my number 8, would be the fantasy adventure style game. And these games, very similar to dungeon crawlers, fantasy theme. Usually you're taking on the role of heroes. You're going on different adventures. I prefer the fantasy adventure games that are a little bit more open-ended. Yes, there might be some ultimate objective, some ultimate end game or winning condition, but the way that players go about it, the process and the steps that they take along the way is within their control. They can make their decisions. They do not have a predetermined path that they must take. And among those games, fantasy adventure games that I enjoy, Roombound, whether it be 2nd or 3rd edition, I have both games in my collection and I enjoy them for different and yet similar reasons. Prophecy, a game from Vlaada Chvátil from many years ago. Mage Knight, which although is a scenario-based game, again, the process that players take to go to accomplish that scenario is open-ended enough for me to thoroughly enjoy it and enjoy it as kind of like a sandbox experience. Legends of Andor by Michael Menzel. This is more of a linear game. You do have very particular chapters, if you will, in your adventure that players have to go through one by one. However, I really enjoy the aspect, the mechanisms in the game, very mechanical compared to some of these other games, but I still classify it in this list, fantasy adventure, definitely fantasy, definitely adventure, and I enjoy it very much. And that's my number 7 board game mechanic or category, and that is the fantasy adventure game. My number 6 board game mechanic would be contract fulfillment or hidden objectives, missions, if you will, quests, where players have to complete certain objectives, usually objectives that other players are not aware of, and they will gain victory points by doing so. Some of the very popular games that I enjoy within this category include Mercator by Uwe Rosenberg, Marco Polo, the dice placement game by Simone Luciani and Daniel Tascini, Takinoko, the panda-themed game by Antoine Boza, Ticket to Ride by Alan Moon. And yes, I consider those tickets that players are trying to fulfill to be glorified contracts that get them lots of victory points at the end of the game. And Lords of Waterdeep, the worker placement game where most of the points that you're scoring throughout the course of the game are based on these quests that you are taking. They're not necessarily hidden information, but you have to complete specific requirements in order to score the points for those quests, those missions, or those contracts. I just really like the idea of setting yourself up with contracts that you think you can fulfill, and the challenge and the process along the way of seeing whether or not you're actually able to carry out those contracts and score their rewards. Really cool, really fun. My number 6 board game mechanic, contract fulfillment. And now we're going to move on to the top 5, what I always refer to as the cream of the crop. These are my absolutely 5 favorite board game mechanics or 5 favorite board game categories. And my number 5 would be what I'm referring to as the tactical card game. And usually these are 2-player only games, although there are a few exceptions. And players are tactically reacting to the other player. It's usually some sort of combat theme that's taking place, quite often, very often, a fantasy mage versus mage type of experience. Now, some of the games that I enjoy from this category of tactical card game include, of course, the grandfather, really, of this style of game, Magic the Gathering. Also, games like Keyforge, a recent Richard Garfield release from a few years back. Game of Thrones, the living card game, which I actually have right back here. And this game could actually accommodate up to 6 players. And it's very different when you're playing 6 players as opposed to 2, but it still has that tactical feel to it. I really just like responding to the situation, placing down cards, sometimes losing those cards because they're defeated or eliminated by your opponents, and then having to place new cards and react to your current set of circumstances. Android Netrunner, which is a very asymmetrical tactical card game, because what your opponent is trying to do is completely different than what you are trying to do. So that's something to factor in. The Call of Cthulhu living card game, and Summoner Wars, which has a spatial element incorporated. Not only are you playing down cards, but these cards are actually moving, and where they're related in the grid, the player map that you use, determines what they're capable of doing and what they're not capable of doing. So I really, really enjoy these tactical card games. I'll admit that from a collector's perspective, I enjoy getting additional products and expansions that add new cards to the mix for further deck construction, deck customizing options, and also just new strategies that can be incorporated in the game. My number 5 board game mechanic or board game category, the tactical card game. Now we move on to my number 4 board game mechanic, and that is city building. Games where a city is under development. A city is being constructed as the players take their actions. And not only that, but as they build these different parts of the city, these parts of the city will grant additional new options, new actions that players can now take. So as the city grows, the game evolves and the decisions expand as well. Now, some of the games in this category of city building include classic games like Puerto Rico by Andreas Seyfarth, Le Havre, worker placement game by Uwe Rosenberg, Wisdom of Solomon, The Castles of Burgundy by Stefan Feld, and as I mentioned earlier, Lords of Waterdeep, the worker placement game where you're building the city of Waterdeep, and as you build the city and the different buildings, those are additional actions that will be available to the players. Now, each of the buildings will be under the control of the player who actually built it, so they'll actually get a reward every time another player goes to that building and uses it for its action. So that's something to factor in, whether or not the action's benefit is worth granting its owner an additional reward. Really cool. I just really like the element of city building. I really enjoy how this makes the game feel different in the middle and towards the end than it did at the very beginning, as far as the options and the actions that players can take. My number 4 board game mechanic, city building. Now we move on to my number 3 board game mechanic, and that is area majority. And in particular, I'm distinguishing area majority from area control. I'm not talking about strictly having the control of particular regions on a board or on a map. I'm talking about having majorities in particular areas on the board, where having the majority is to your advantage and it's ultimately the goal of the game. First of all, I have to mention the grandfather of this mechanism, El Grande by Wolfgang Kramer many years ago, former Spiel des Jahres winner, where you're trying to have majorities in the different regions in Spain in order to score points, and where you do get some consolation. You get some points for secondary and for tertiary, depending on the player count. So even if you're not first in that area, it is worth maybe being second or third because you can get some additional victory points. El Grande, Tikal, another Wolfgang Kramer game where area majority is a thing. Tower of Babel by Rainer Knizia. Rhinelander and Merchants of Amsterdam, also by Rainer Knizia. Blood Rage, as I mentioned earlier, which although it seems as an area control game in essence, there is an element of majority because you're trying to have ideally the majority of units in particular regions or provinces before you pillage them. And the majority as far as the strength is concerned, because not all of those units are created equal. Some players are going to have stronger units than others. And of course, they have that modifying card that they play at the end of the game. But by having that majority, you will increase your chances of winning and successfully pillaging these areas. I just really enjoy the aspect of having that majority and working towards the majority and knowing in particular which areas should be the areas that you focus. You obviously are not going to have a majority in all areas on the board. So you really want to zero in on particular areas, on strategic areas that will be to your advantage having control over. My number 3 board game category, area majority. And now we move on to my number 2. And my numbers 1 and 2 are they are distant favorites. Number 3, area majority, is a distant third. There is no way of area majority overtaking number 2 and number 1 anytime in the foreseeable future. My number 2 board game mechanic is worker placement. And worker placement is probably the most popular board game mechanic nowadays. I find that lots of people gravitate towards it, and myself included. It's my number 2. And I just love the idea of having a pool of workers. And sometimes the workers, you can add to them, you can gain additional workers, sometimes not. And there is so many different types of games all over the spectrum as far as how the worker placement actually works. But the idea of having this limited pool of actions represented by these workers and placing them in physical spots on the board that represent the action you're trying to take, quite often blocking an action or at least making it more difficult for another player to take the same action, I find that really cool, really neat. The back and forthness of having to decide where you're going to put your first worker, hope that someone else doesn't take a spot that you're hoping for, that you're coveting in order to place your second worker, and so on and so forth. Now, some of the games that I enjoy in this category include the classic Agricola from many years ago, Uwe Rosenberg's agricultural themed farm, family raising, animal breeding style game. Viticulture, the game of winemaking and growing grapes and bringing them to your cellar and selling different wines and fulfilling different contracts, as I mentioned earlier, contract fulfillment. Raiders of the North Sea, Viking Norse-themed game where players are trying to recruit the right crew members and the right resources in order to go to the harbor, in order to go to the castles and the fortresses and the monasteries even, and raid them and pillage them for resources and victory points. Really cool game. Games like Village, a very unique style of worker placement game where your workers actually have a lifespan and eventually will die. So that's something to consider. Yeah, lots of these games, they're just so fulfilling, so satisfying for me. I really enjoy this worker placement mechanism, and when a game has worker placement as one of its mechanisms, I'm pretty confident that I'm at least gonna like the game. I might not necessarily love it, but I still haven't played a worker placement game that I've been meh about, or a game that I've been totally turned off of. Every worker placement game for me at least has a passing grade. My number 2 board game mechanic, worker placement. And now we move on to my number 1, the final game or the final mechanic or mechanism for this list, and that is deck building. And I'm talking about games like Dominion, the grandfather of the deck building, where the deck building is taking place as the game plays. You're not constructing decks before the game, but instead every player starts with a basic deck to start the game, a weak deck with very weak cards. And as the game progresses, they're acquiring better cards, more powerful cards that grant them more actions, more resources, more money. And they're trying to purchase additional cards, more expensive cards that grant them better actions. They're trying to gain cards that get them victory points, perhaps. Sometimes deck building is just one of many mechanisms, and there's another ulterior motive or an additional winning condition in the game that's not necessarily points. But I really just enjoy that process of strengthening your deck, eliminating weak cards, trying to go for the best cards. Other than Dominion, I have lots of games that I enjoy in this category. Marvel Legendary, DC Deck Building, Thunderstone Quest, Clank, the Deck Building Adventure, Shadow Rift, Legendary Encounters. I'm looking at all my deck building games right now, trying to think. Aeon's End. So many really cool, fun deck building games. Hero Realms, Star Realms, Cthulhu Realms, Valley of the Kings. So many deck building games. I can go on and on and on. Mage Knight incorporates deck building as well. Just really enjoy this mechanism. It's such a fun thing to partake in and to build this engine that is your deck as efficiently as possible. But at the same time, have that element of randomness as far as shuffling the cards and seeing whether or not the cards that you want turn out exactly when you need them. Really fun, really enjoyable. I don't think worker placement is going to surpass deck building anytime soon. For now, deck building is my #1 board game mechanic of all time. And that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what you think about these 10 board game mechanics or categories. Tell me what are your favorite board game categories and perhaps what you think about mine. Well, that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.